Welcome back to The Bulwark Goes to Hollywood. My name is Sonny Bunch. I'm culture editor at The Bulwark. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dade Hayes, who is the author along with Don Chmielewski. Did I get that right?
You did.
Close enough? Okay, good. The author of Binge Times, Inside Hollywood's Furious Billion-Dollar Battle to Take Down Netflix. Dade is the business editor of Deadline, and he has written 2 books about entertainment before, as well as writing for the New York Times, Variety, and the podcast Business Wars. Are you in Larchmont right now?
I am.
Are you coming to us from New York? Great.
Yes, exactly.
Great. So thanks for being on the show, Dade. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much, Sonny. Glad to be here.
All right. So your book is it is fascinating because it is very much a first draft of history that we all just lived through. It is a fascinating read to kind of to go over and revisit some of these things that we have lived through here in the last couple of years. And the first thing I want to ask you is, how did the book actually? So I feel like this book must have changed pretty radically after the pandemic hits and the streaming wars really kick off into high gear. What was it like to be writing this in the midst of all of that?
It's a great question. I mean, we have spent a lot of time thinking about how to present it, and we do have a section toward the beginning of the book where we try to lay out for the reader a bit of our, without getting too meta, kind of like the author's journey, just as we all were going through a crazy journey through the pandemic. So yeah, we hooked up together as co-authors in 2019. We had worked together, Dawn and I, at Deadline, and kind of, chronicled this on the site together, often co-bylining stories and coming up with enterprise ideas and so forth. And so it was a natural collaboration to end up doing the book. But when we set off on the path, it was 2019. We had a certain, travel plan and a kind of grandiose notion of like where we would end up and what we would try to do. The aim was to document these 5 new services that were hitting the market all in a cluster in late 2019 and 2020. Disney Plus, Apple TV Plus, HBO Max, Peacock, Quibi. Yes, we may talk to you about Quibi at some point in this show. But we had these grand designs, and then, as you say, the pandemic really hit like a thunderbolt. And at first we were thrown, we obviously needed to buy extra time with our publisher to get, the manuscript in order. And we kind of were regrouping. And then we realized like the pandemic itself and how that shifted everybody's habits and just created this tidal wave of interest in streaming, as well as the incredible challenge and the hurdle of trying to get a product launched during this time. It made it even more fascinating. It just made it even more, I think, essential to try to, soldier on through it. So we needed extra time, but we built a bit more reflection on the pandemic into that, and it kind of that plays a bigger role in the story.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great metaphor in the preface here. I just want to actually read it for folks because it is I think perfect. Here's from your guys' preface. Quote: "The pandemic did more than elevate streaming as an inextricable element of modern life. It seemed to almost inject all of us into the stream, like platelets flowing through blood in a massive vein," and that is end quote. Sorry, and that is like kind of a perfect metaphor for the Zoom life that we have all lived, right? Or that we lived for, I don't know, six to 18 months, depending on where you lived, in the country, because it really did feel like we were not just watching all of our entertainment via stream, but also living via stream.
It's so true. I mean, telemedicine and school and, city council meetings and, arts and entertainment. It was all happening virtually. It was all happening. I live in New York, and I'm a real, fan of the live theater, and that was just an agonizing period of watching people. I mean, it was inventive and you complimented them for their enterprise, but it was like, oh man, agonizing to sit at home and not be able to go to a show. So it's true. We were all sort of thrust into this. So it was like, I mean, we joke that we would, take breaks from our day of being on Zooms and filing for a website in order to watch streaming. It was like you go from one side of the room to the other, like little screen, big screen. And I'm not the first to make that sort of quip, but it really is kind of profound when you look back on it. It did, I think we're still, feeling some of the after effects, and we may be for some time.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was a revolutionary time, and it really has changed how the business of Hollywood works. So let's talk about let's talk about that big shift here, because I mean that's the focus of this book. What was it about this kind of launch period that most jumped out to you as you were reporting this out? Right? What was it? What was the big challenge for these companies? Both from a technological and from a consumer standpoint.
Well, it's this historic moment. People have said, how do you know when to just sort of put a finger down on the map and say, this is where we're going to go? We felt this was the signal moment, the culmination of a lot of the strategic moves and dilemmas that these companies had faced, and it all came to the fore in this time period. So you have the traditional companies, NBC, Universal, Warner Media, Disney, all trying to grapple with a legacy business that is shrinking. The pay TV bundle definitely getting smaller and smaller. The economics there are challenged. And yet they had to try to, launch a full-blown streaming service, which, requires engineers. It requires the actual technology. You see Disney acquiring BAMTech. You see, Warner Media, by virtue of being owned by AT&T, trying to leverage, those resources. NBC, its cousins at Comcast with cable. You have a lot of those people leaning on things. Then you cross the aisle in big tech. You've got Apple. Finally, after dithering for 2 decades about television, they had Apple TV, but it was really a kind of a first step. They had never gone directly to programming and to really trying to penetrate the living room in a complete way, and you had them finally taking the plunge. So in terms of their imperatives, they are different. The tech, obviously, a company like Apple TV Plus is like a rounding error. It
Right.
isn't a huge like all stakes bet. But it's reputationally interesting, and we found it fascinating that they weren't very buttoned up. This is a company that prides itself on only launching, products when they're ready. Certainly Steve Jobs, that was his legacy, and they've tried to carry that forward. And it launched with a bit of a wobbly slate, not a perfect slate. And then back across the aisle with traditional entertainment, you could just sort of see the anxiety and just the pure flop sweat of like having to push into streaming when you don't even know the economics of it. And it was uncertain in 2019 and 2020. Here we are in 2022, and we'll probably get to Netflix soon in this conversation, but all bets are off in terms of like, is streaming a good business? Can you actually scale it? Can you reward shareholders? There had been this kind of article of faith that, streaming is kind of it's the alpha and omega, and now we're in this very uncertain period. So I think uncertainty underlies the entire story. Like nobody really kind of knew that they were parking a Good Humor truck at and they were the only one at the playground on a hot summer day, and everybody would just flock to them and buy. Nobody really knew.
Yeah, you mentioned Netflix. Let's talk about Netflix, because obviously, the subtitle of this book is about trying to catch. Netflix is the big, 800-pound gorilla in the room, right? And it is that because of its stock value, which has declined pretty precipitously over the last couple of days, but really the last year, it's down almost 2/3, which was something to behold. But it is what has always been What has always been curious to me about Netflix is this idea that it would be the only one. That we've looked at, 100 years of television, and somebody somewhere was like, you know what, we'll just have one streaming service. It'll be Netflix, and that makes sense for everyone. How did that happen? How did we get to that point where Wall Street and others were like, maybe there'll just be one Netflix? That makes sense.
Well, it is remarkable. I mean, that is a very direct, seemingly simple question, but with many, many answers. I'll try my best to kind of unpack it. But it is fascinating because, they emerged from a field of three. It was Hulu, Amazon Prime, and Netflix all came to market in 2007 with a streaming service. Netflix has had 10 years under its belt selling DVD or, renting out DVDs prior to that. So they had the advantage of all that data and just, momentum as a company. But, it was a 3-horse town for, the first decade plus. But to your point, I think they did emerge as the pure play, as the one that you could sign up for without any complications. Hulu, for much of its life, initially had advertising. There wasn't an ad-free version. It was primarily enjoyed on, laptop computers, even desktop computers, God forbid, way back when. And so it just wasn't very competitive. I mean, it was competitive, but not quite. It just sort of like was trailing the other two. So anyway, to your main question, I mean, why were they alone? It's really, I think, a cyclical phenomenon that we've seen in the entertainment business over many years. The music business was the last big go-round, where there is a kind of complacency that sets in, a kind of mindset of like, oh, we couldn't possibly be, unseated from our throne. That's ridiculous. And so Netflix comes along and willingly, pays big bucks to license out shows. And so the media business, the media companies view it as just a great customer and a great sort of, a supplement. DVD revenue had completely died away at that point. And now you have streaming and, suddenly Netflix was, I mean, it's funny, Disney has talked a lot about pulling back, Pixar movies and Star Wars and Marvel, off of Netflix, which they have. But you still have shows, like Grey's Anatomy and others that, so it's like a mint was spent by Netflix to get these shows. And so the companies just saw it as kind of easy money, and they really underestimated, the famous quote from Jeff Bewkes about Netflix as, oh yeah, it's like the Albanian army is going to invade, really like scoffing at the possibility that Netflix as a company could rise to the level where they would, challenge or even overtake the big media companies. And now we're kind of in that, interestingly enough, now Netflix is going to be valued more like a media company, and the media companies are kind of in this uncertain period about how they want to present themselves to Wall Street. So it's sort of fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, because this was always Netflix's secret sauce, right? Is they're not really a media company; they're a tech company. They're algorithms and they're streaming technology, and they are interfaces. They're not a production company, but now they are a production company, and they're running into all the problems a production company has. Which is interesting. One thing that you mentioned in your book, and I had never really thought about it this way, but it makes perfect sense, is that the studios are run by people. People have incentives, and the incentives for studio executives is to hit their markers so they can make bonuses. And the Netflix basically took advantage of that to build their service at the expense of everybody else.
That's a great point. It's absolutely true. No, we did spend a lot of time talking to people about that, because even people who are benefiting from it and have been kind of caught up in that recognize that it's not a sustainable. It is a sustainable model if you don't intend to keep rising higher and holding competition at bay, because tech companies obviously have a very different makeup. They don't it's more about equity. It's more about and now with, as you say, Netflix stock being down 2/3 over the past year, you have a lot of disenchantment internally at Netflix saying, hey, wait, you paid me all these options and these shares, and now I'm underwater, and that's not cool. So it can kind of cut both ways. But in success, if you assume that you're gaining and improving and getting customers and things are moving in the right direction, it can be more lucrative to be an employee at Netflix. But there's just a different mindset. Yeah, media companies, public, they got to hit their numbers. They got to hit the profit numbers. And you see this acrimony play out where you have business leaders at media companies. One famous example, you may know, or maybe your listeners know, is John Landgraf, who runs FX. Mm-hmm. Very known as a very thoughtful, tastemaker within the TV business. and has really built that brand up, enormously over the last, 20 years. And he has openly complained about, Silicon Valley gets judged by a different standard. They don't have to book profit. They don't have to, tell their shareholders that they're making a 20% margin. And it's true. I think he's got a good point. There's just different rules apply. But for all of the lip service at, Disney and these other companies about getting competitive with tech, they could make bigger adjustments to do that. I think they could make more systemic change. It's just going to take time for them to decide if that's the path they want to take.
Yeah, and as Netflix was building up its business, I mean, the studio execs, at Disney and elsewhere were happy to, get an extra 8 figures worth of revenue.
Completely,
because take our Pixar movies, please. we need that money.
1,000%. And then the company was, and by extension, the bonused employees, people with skin in the game, for sure.
Yeah. So you mentioned taste-making, and that is I think the undercurrent of a lot of the discussion of the various services, because Netflix is kind of a fire hose. It's just, here's a lot of stuff. But then you have Apple TV, which is much more curated, HBO Max, which has its kind of the HBO aura around it, and Hulu, which has teamed with FX, with John Landgraf and those guys. How are those two different strategies kind of playing out as the streaming wars kick off? I mean, is it from your perspective, just as a business person and also a fan of media, like how are you watching all that play out?
Yeah, it's fascinating because you're exactly right in sort of assessing where everybody is. Apple, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, came out of the gate with a very mixed opening slate. Morning Show was their marquee show. Sort of, I think we can agree, mixed bag. Some merits, maybe not tons of merit. I don't know. Not a bad show, but like kind of, I don't know, not a consensus winner. And the verdict was overall rather mixed. And then they kind of have, to their credit, found their footing. Obviously, Ted Lasso, but even more recently, shows that have been on in the last few months, Severance and Pachinko. These are really accomplished, interesting shows that kind of build on their prestige. So it's taken them a while to get there, but they do have that kind of selectivity and no library, which is even more interesting. Like there's not a lot of you can tune into on Apple TV Plus. But the others, just if I can speak a little more generally about the others, it's everybody is chasing like a Mandalorian. That's the problem. Like Morning Show was the marquee show for Apple, but I'm not even sure it brought as many people in the door as they hoped. I mean, maybe it did. Mm-hmm. We'll never know because there's not actual data. But I think The Mandalorian really became the poster child for like what everybody wanted because it had a tie to a gigantic recognizable universe, which is Star Wars. It had, just everybody kind of was curious about it. So like, if I want to watch Mandalorian, I'm going to need to get Disney Plus. That was it. And HBO Max, because I think we document in the book, with the pandemic, HBO Max and Peacock were the most challenged in terms of getting new shows on the air. And they both suffered. They both came out of the gate pretty weak. And as we speak here today in 2022, they're on a firmer foundation, especially HBO Max, I think is in a groove. But I think at the start, that's one reason it was fascinating to see them sally forth, during the midst of a global crisis, because they couldn't get shows produced. They couldn't, in the case of Peacock, they didn't have, Premier League soccer. They didn't have the Olympics. They didn't have the sports element that people like. So, I've drifted maybe a little from your question. I don't know if that addressed it, but they each are looking for their identity. That's really what it is. Like, what is the identity? And it's hard. There are 300 plus, subscription services in the US. Like, how do you stand out? It's enormously challenging. And notice that we haven't even mentioned Paramount Plus and Stars and AMC Plus, and there's a huge roster that probably a lot of your listeners are checking out regularly, but it's really hard to stand out.
Yeah, I mean it's a fascinating time just because I am skeptical of a lot of these things surviving for much, for more than 5 or 10 years, because there are only so many things that people will sign up for. And one of the really fascinating parts of your book is looking at the evolution of Hulu and how that kind of worked into the Disney Plus, ESPN Plus universe. I like Hulu a lot. I think I'm a relative latecomer to Hulu. I only signed up a year or two ago. But it really has a great library. It has great originals. But I don't think it could survive on its own without being part of the ESPN Disney universe. Are we headed back to a place where you're going to see, like, Netflix will probably be on its own? You'll have HBO Max teaming up with Discovery Plus, right?
That's right.
For a bundle there. You'll have Hulu, ESPN, whatever. And like AMC Plus has its own like kind of little mini universe with Shudder and all the rest.
Yeah.
I mean, is that where we're headed back to, just like a series of smaller bundles? We're gonna re-plug in the cord?
Yeah, I think we are. And it's not the end of the world, I don't think, because like you, I was a little late. I wasn't later on Hulu, but I was once they offered it as a bundle. Like, I hadn't taken the plunge on ESPN Plus, and so I was like, great, bundle me up, because I think it is a pain point how much friction there is and how many services are out there, both from an economic standpoint. Like, obviously discretionary spending is not infinite, so we all make choices about what we will and won't spend on. But even logistically, okay, I'm sitting in front of my screen, I want to access this content, how do I find it? I heard X show is great, where is it? So the bundling, I think, does ease some of that angst about finding content, and it just makes business sense. I mean, it's been remarkable to watch the new crew in charge at Warner Brothers Discovery just make no bones about, like, we're bundling. Not only bundling it, but actually merging it into one service. And I think that's also kind of to the Hulu point. We did determine, based on extensive reporting, both inside and outside Disney, even though officially their position is, heck no, we would never do that as of now. I think within the next 2 to 3 years, you see Hulu formally kind of brought inside of Disney Plus. Now, how do you bring American Horror Story in, where preschoolers are accessing Mickey Mouse Clubhouse? I don't know exactly, but they already are, I think, pretty far along with parental controls in general on Disney. So I feel like the tech is going to help them solve that. But anyway, I think it's inevitable that Hulu becomes part of the fold.
Well, because it's an interesting technical problem, and you guys talk about a little bit about this in I think it's maybe it's the chapter 9. It's chapter 9. I want to read this passage because it was something that has jumped out at me in the past, and I'm not entirely sure what the answer is. Quote, "What no one knows, even the great and powerful Amazon," Khan agreed, "is how to guide sports viewers through this transition." This is a chapter you're talking about sports and bringing sports to streaming. "Unlike in the traditional bundled world, there is no channel surfing in streaming," he pointed out. "When consumers look through their on-screen grid at night, they'll see certain things and think, oh, I didn't know the next game was on. With streaming, it has to be must-see TV," end quote. And here's I mean, there it really is a problem, and one that Apple TV kind of solves. I have an Apple TV, and it's nice to be able to kind of go to the place where I see all of the different things that I have, that I've been watching, and they're like, okay, more of this is here. But it's not the same as flipping through the channels. It's not the same as looking at, the DirecTV guide and trying to figure out what is on a channel I might not have watched before. It's not the same as stumbling upon a baseball game that I didn't know was on and was like, okay, yeah, I'll watch this, fine. It's a different thing, and I'm curious if you have a sense of how the streamers understand this problem, and if they see it as a place where they need to work together to kind of make it easier for people to, integrate all of these different services together.
I think they do. I think you even heard it last week, quite honestly, in the commentary out of Netflix. They were admitting that it's kind of a many-fold challenge for them right now, which is improve the caliber of their programming, which to hear them admit that kind of candidly was pretty stunning. But then also improve the interface. I mean, they're very proud of their product, and they should be. It's the best in class. I think it's the most seamless. It gives them a huge advantage. But I think they haven't quite reckoned with, you alluded earlier to the fire hose of programming. They just have a ton of stuff, a ton of product on the shelf that they have to figure out how to show off. But also kind of more to what you're getting at and what you just read from in the book is this idea of the serendipity. I mean, television, there's an immediacy to television that I think is not fully being captured in streaming. And if you posit, as many do, that the entire television bundle is moving to streaming, you don't want to lose that kind of property, that alchemy of television in that transition, both from a business standpoint, advertising standpoint, and just from a viewer engagement standpoint. So I think a lot of people are working at it. Peacock, I know, takes a lot of knocks, and it's not exactly at the top of the heap at the moment, but I thought they came up with a pretty novel attack with exactly what you were discussing in mind. Like, they wanted it to have a live feel where you have rolling stock when you tune in. And the Matt Strauss, who was running it at that point, he's still there but kind of got kicked upstairs to bigger challenges. But he told us that he thinks of a lot of SVOD services, like Netflix and others, as being like a casino. No clocks on the walls, no sense of direction, no windows. So you kind of don't know. And, I've asked Ted Sarandos directly, like, why don't you advertise when your drops are? Why not say 12:01, you're going to see the next season of Stranger Things? And they're dogged. They were at the time. We're going to see if they're willing to maybe adapt a little bit. But they have this dogged belief in on-demand, the on-demand value proposition. It's available when you want it. If it's 3 a.m, if it's noon, if it's, if you're in, far-flung Southeast Asia, if you're in Europe, if you're in America, like it's always there to pull down off the shelf. And anything that's like driving toward tune-in is old school, in his opinion, as is theatrical exhibition, as are other aspects of the old way. They believe binge releasing is still what viewers want. So I guess it's just going to be interesting. Sports is the key. I think you were right on when you mentioned sports, because we do spend some time in the book grappling with sports. That's a huge piece of business when you've got, there's nothing bigger in the live TV world at this time. Even awards shows and other things that used to be reliable revenue or ratings generators are not. So if they can't figure out a way to kind of leverage sports, Amazon will be a big test this fall when they start their exclusive run with NFL rights on Thursday nights. How do they, but that's an interesting thing. You can be a media maven, right? Media junkie. You're on your laptop during the day, you're on your phone, and you still might not know when or how to get that football game. Like the first few weeks, I think we're going to hear a lot of grumbling and grousing. I live in New York, Apple, and you said you have an Apple TV and presumably Apple TV Plus. And so they put some Major League Baseball games. It's a Friday night doubleheader now on Apple TV Plus. And there were a lot of howls in New York when people realized, like, wait, I can't just flip on. It's not a simulcast. This is the only place you can see it. And so, I don't know. I think there's going to be benefits from the ones who learn how to work those levers. They're already spending, if I can finish my very long-winded answer on this, they're already spending quite lavishly, the streamers, on traditional advertising. We saw it Super Bowl Sunday. You just see it when you're watching anything that is commercially supported, mainly sports. And I watch a lot of it. You see them hawking their wares all the time, and it tends to be like shows. But I could see HBO Max trying to galvanize interest, like, hey, it's Stanley Cup playoff time, and we've got the first round series between, the teams. And, kind of, it's a little bit old school, but taking the old school, if it ain't broke, promotional announcements have been around forever, and I imagine you'll see more of that.
Yeah. I have an advertising question. You mentioned advertising.
Hmm.
I want to change that slightly. Just redirect slightly. Uh, we are headed toward a moment when all of the major streaming services, it seems like, are going to be offering an ad-supported tier, which, as somebody, I mean, look, I've grown up through cable and the early part of the streaming revolution, broadcast. I've lived through it all, and I've done both, the ad-based stuff and the non-ad-based stuff. And I have to say, I'm watching AMC's Better Call Saul live
Hmm.
now, like an idiot. Because or at least that's how I feel, because I'm sitting there like waiting for the advertisements to be over, and I have a hard time believing that people really want to go back to that, even if it's to save $5 on your subscription or whatever. But I mean, it feels like such a step backwards for these companies to be like, what we need advertising. That's how we're gonna save all these networks.
I share a lot of that sentiment. I feel very similarly, and I have certain shows. Atlanta for me is one where it's just like that's the way you got to get. I mean, if you don't want to wait 24 hours for it to pop up on Hulu, but it is true that it's an odd thing. It's also particularly odd for Disney, HBO Max, and now Netflix to go from ad free and then because usually it's gone the other way. If you think of Hulu, if you think of cable TV,
Mm-hmm.
Bravo a million years ago was ad free. MTV had no ads, and then eventually they phase in advertising. So it is an interesting thing to turn that on its head and try to do it in reverse. The Hulu example, though, I've talked to them a lot and just looked at the numbers a lot, and it's still heavily weighted toward the ad supported because they've opened up a gap. If you remember, they kind of tinkered with their pricing structure, so it's about half as much. I think is it still at $6? It might have risen a bit from there, but let's call it 6 or 7 for the ad supported, and then the ad free I think is still at 12. So you do pay more, and their findings have been that people just are okay saving a few bucks. I mean, the ad load, I think, let's not also overlook the ad load, meaning the number of ads you have to sit through, is a lot less in streaming. It's about a third. I think Peacock is capped at like 5 minutes an hour, and if most of the others are in that range. So, and then the other thing, I was talking to somebody yesterday with Netflix, if they were smart, they might just scrupulously avoid breaks. Like Hulu, I really like Hulu, but I'm not a big fan of their ad experience because you really get hit with breaks. Now they're short, 30 seconds to a minute, but they're really hitting the viewer with a lot of breaks, which is a bummer.
So let's talk about one of the misfires of the streaming revolution. I think it's fair to describe Quibi as such. What happened there? Because I mean, it's an interesting idea, and I do think that they got hurt by the pandemic, but it seemed to have been just kind of a goat rodeo from the get-go.
That is a very accurate description. They raised $1.75 billion in startup financing. So it was a very well-funded effort led by Jeffrey Katzenberg, who has a great pedigree, through his time at Disney and DreamWorks. So definitely had A-list talent. Meg Whitman, also former head of eBay, was the CEO of the company. And they went around making A-list deals with top creators. But the actual experience of their service was, I think, a questionable one in that it was mobile, so they had no smart TV app. If you wanted if you had been watching a show on your phone and then wanted to finish it at home in the living room, you couldn't. It had no shareability, so if you really loved a particular clip and you wanted to share it with your friends on social media, you couldn't. And it just never quite mustered up like a show that became like a huge water cooler show, to the extent that the water cooler even exists these days. But it never really had like a, just that show. We all can name examples of the signature shows, and as I mentioned, every service needs their calling card. Every service needs a Mandalorian, or back when when Netflix was stepping into the content game, they needed House of Cards and Orange is the New Black. They needed a lineup that would make people come back for more. And Quibi just never really did develop that. And so you know, in our reporting, somebody described it as just like a business idea in search. It was like a solution in search of a problem. Like nobody had said like, hey, there's nothing I can watch on my phone if I'm online at the bank. I mean, and let's not forget also that TikTok was rising to a position of absolute domination of this space. I mean, I covered Alphabet earnings the other day, and they were saying, YouTube is basically losing share to TikTok, which is kind of an unbelievable situation. So, it's very competitive out there. And for one final thing I'll throw in is they're doing all this and asking people to sign up for subscriptions. TikTok, YouTube, the mobile video kind of wants to be free. I think that's, Verizon learned that lesson with Go 90, which failed. So they kind of went on in spite of all the warning signs, and it lasted a few months. But you can still watch Quibi. You can watch it on the Roku.
Well, it's on Roku now.
Right? Watch the shows on the Roku channel. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to read those chapters because it is a fascinating mixture of just having too much money. I mean, they had too much money, which led to real problems with expectations, right? I mean, they couldn't just do the small stuff; they had to get big names. What did they pay Reese Witherspoon to narrate?
I think it was $10 million to narrate a documentary series.
Crazy.
Yeah, you're right, and exactly. They were trying to deliver a Netflix level of programming on your phone, which I think, as you started off by saying, like, there's something kind of laudable about the ambition, I suppose, but it really didn't square with reality. They also were very interested in this technology they developed called turnstile, where if you had the phone vertically and you switch it to landscape, that it would intuitively shift so that the experience, like, it almost like was a production feature, that you wouldn't lose there was no latency, or there was no kind of jitter when you would do that. It was very seamless. But I think it's kind of one of these gimmicks like smell-o-vision or something. Like, you don't hang an entire business on that, I don't think. So easy to make fun of Quibi, but I think other people have come to their defense recently and just said, and I think with some reason, that they took a big swing and they missed. And we don't put them through the ringer in the book, but it's kind of an appealing target. I mean, they just,
Well, I mean, it is. It's one of the only like real obvious failures of this whole period. I mean, everybody's still kind of struggling to find their way, and like in a way, you have to give Katzenberg and Meg Whitman, right?
Meg Whitman.
You have to give them credit for pulling the plug and just being like, all right, we're going to give our investors their money back. This is not working. We're sorry, we gave it a shot. But it is interesting to see something just really kind of crash and burn. We haven't had too many examples of that on a massive corporate level in this period.
Right. Usually they might get acquired or subsumed into some other entity. We've talked a bit about just the kind of moving parts of streaming in this conversation, and you could have imagined Quibi perhaps finding that path as well. I mean, ultimately it did through Roku, but it was just bought for spare parts. I mean, pennies on the dollar. So yeah, it is unusual for the flame out, for the idea that, oh wait, I once had an app on my phone called Quibi, and then it just vanished. And recently we saw it with CNN Plus, which didn't last nearly as long as Quibi.
That's another one for sure. That was a kind of spectacular misfire. Though CNN still exists, so if you that is, it's funny you mentioned CNN Plus, and it does feel like CNN or the news, the one thing that we are missing, I think, from the non-skinny bundles, right? The just the straight up streaming platforms is like a straight news service. I guess you can watch Fox News on like Pluto TV on your smart TV or something, but or like Newsmax or OANN or whatever, right? But like just having the reason CNN Plus didn't make any sense to me, I've discussed this with people, but it didn't make any sense to me because I couldn't just watch CNN. on it. That's all I really would want. I would be able. I would basically be able to cut the cord at that point if I could just watch CNN in addition to everything else.
Right, exactly. No, that's totally right. And guess who really prevented them from putting the full live stream on there? It was all their pay TV partners, because basically they said, like, if you do that, then we're going to drop you, and your channel, which is, carried in 85 million homes, is going to lose its distribution. And this is the story of, HBO and ESPN and a million other services where what they came to market with, HBO figured out a way to finally get there. But there was a lot of pain along the way, and ESPN is still feeling it. Discovery, I think a lot of their content is it's watered down, because basically you can't offer the A grade stuff. And it's true. I mean, as you were talking about, hey, there's nobody really doing a full blown news offering. I do think of, NBC News Now and CBSN and some of these, but then I was sort of thinking, well, but it's not really the A-list talent. You're not seeing Lester Holt on that. You're not seeing Nora O'Donnell. It's, with all respect to those guys, kind of the whole system is like a farm team of on-air talent that you pay much less because you're in streaming, and the ad rates are lower and the distribution fees are lower, and so it's a different business model. So yeah, nobody really has brought the premium top end product, and you see it over at Fox, which is interesting. They've incubated this service called Fox Nation, and some of their talent, Tucker Carlson and others, have kind of dabbled with programming on there, but you're not going to see, Hannity or the big guns like with a full-blown show on Fox Nation. It's just not, because they don't want to compete with themselves.
Right. And Fox Nation almost seems like a Uber fan service, basically a way for like fans of Fox News to send Fox News a little more money, be like, hey, we're really into you, more than an actual news service. I mean, obviously they have shows and podcasts and whatever. I don't want to denigrate any of my friends at Fox News and the great work they're doing at Fox Nation, but it's interesting that there is that gap. In your book, you talk about how sports basically is the last thing keeping broadcast afloat. The iron, what is it? The iron channels. The
big iron, yeah.
The big iron, yeah. Is there a? I mean, look, NFL is locked up for the next 10 years, right? It was $110 billion worth of rights deals across all the, like, crazy amounts of money for a single sports league. But, is that the only thing that is keeping broadcast going at this point?
Primarily. I mean, you have these big signal moments, election years, get big ratings. So you have debates, and you have, all the campaign drama leading up to an election, and we've seen it certainly the last 2 years, last two cycles rather. Given who's been involved in those elections, it's been a hugely watched contest. So those are other big moments that the networks like to point to for hope. That is another thing that's there. But yeah, sports is kind of really the last roundup. If you think of the Oscar ratings, think of the Emmy Awards. I mean, go down the list of awards shows, the Grammys, they're all losing altitude. And there's even a sense that, it wouldn't be the craziest thing in the world. Look, I watched Coachella on YouTube. Like, I think music works well on YouTube. I think some events that we've taken for granted as being part of the broadcast bundle, like awards, could prosper on a streaming service, I think. Potentially. I mean, Hulu, you might have noticed, booked that Red Bull plane stunt where it's like a live event where you tune into Hulu, and you said you just got Hulu. This could be appointment viewing for you, Sonny. But it's like literally these two planes like diving out of the sky, and they switch. It's called Plane Swap. It might have already aired. Hopefully it didn't. But anyway,
I don't see. This is a problem. I have no idea what you're talking about.
I know you're like,
is this a big
you're like, I love Hulu.
What's happening?
I would watch a plane crash in midair. Yeah, but yeah. So they're trying. But to me, that's a sign of them trying to play at the edges, and I think we will see the once unthinkable of a big awards show or other programming, migrating online.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was pretty much everything I wanted to ask you. What I always like to close these interviews by asking if there's anything I should have asked, if there's anything you think people should know about the streaming wars, the state of the entertainment industry in general. I mean, what should folks know that we didn't talk about?
Well, I think the next big thing to watch for, and I know it's a bit of a businessy thing, but I think even the casual viewer at home will be able to kind of discern this, is you've had this giant stumble by the leader of the field, Netflix, right? They're on their back foot. By their own admission, they're trying to regroup. They're trying to figure out, how do we provide advertising and make more money there? How do we crack down on password sharing? How do we improve the caliber of our programming? They've got tons of stuff to figure out. They're in disarray. Their stock is down, right? So all they do is streaming. They don't have to worry about theme parks or linear channels or movie studios. They just have to do one. 2,000 engineers wake up every morning to make one app, So then you move over to the broadcasters and the networks. And what I think I would close this conversation with is like, what is their counterpunch? Is it, we do streaming better and we're going to effectively it'll be like the TiVo story, where the once high-flying leader that introduced the concept of time shifting then just gets overtaken by market forces, and we don't even think of TiVo, we just think of the DVR. Will that be the fate of Netflix, or will it be a case of overcorrection? So, there's a big series of presentations in New York in May called the Upfronts, and it's going to be fascinating to watch. Like, does NBC, does CBS, do all these companies take the stage and say, linear viewing is still, do they wave the banner for the old way of like, yes, we locked up the NFL. We have, shows like Yellowstone. We have, are they going to kind of, or, Better Call Saul is a great example. There are still shows, Walking Dead. There are top shows, even in the scripted world, not many, but there's a few. So are the networks going to basically counter by saying, and think of Disney in 2019, it was all about streaming. We've like put everything but the kitchen sink into this. We bought Fox, we bought BAMTech, we bought all these things, and now we're going to go over the top. Or is now the stance more like, yeah, we've got some streaming, but boy, do we have great, living room shows if you want to just cozy up to the traditional TV. So I just think that tension of like, they've been going at this streaming prize, like just, that's why we titled the book what we did. It's like they were all just like racing after Netflix, trying to desperately, kind of take them down. But do they want to take them down? Do they even want to bother? That's kind of where we are. We're at this very interesting intersection right now.
Yeah. And you've got the studios out at CinemaCon right now basically saying, hey, we still love theaters.
Oh, I know.
We're not going, we're never going to do that again. Us folks at HBO Max, we're never going to do that thing with Warner Brothers again. We promise.
I'm so glad you brought up the movie business. We don't have even time to talk movies, but that was an interesting front. I had written a book about movies and come out of movie coverage in my career. So, and Dawn and I were complementary in that way. She'd done a lot more tech than I had, and I had done a bit more in the movie side. So as we got into 2019, 2020, the pandemic hits, all these things are going on. I'm saying, Dawn, we gotta cover the movies, because that's really the hot spot. And if you think of Black Widow and the controversy there, if you think of all the, as you said, the HBO Max, Warner Brothers movies, like huge decisions are being made, like planets are being tilted off of their axis, and this is really in a lot of ways the big fight in streaming. So that's one more to watch.
Yeah. Well, Dade, thank you very much for being on the show. The book again is Binge Times: Inside Hollywood's Furious $1 billion Battle to Take Down Netflix. I'll link to it in the newsletter, so you can just click on it and go buy it there. He wrote it with Don Shimoleski.
Yay.
Got it.
Well done.
Got it. It's well worth your time. Again, it is very interesting to read as a kind of first draft of history. We just lived through it. Let's relive all this again. And it's full of, fascinating little nuggets. So definitely check it out. I am Sonny Bunch, culture editor at The Bulwark, and I will be back next week with another episode of The Bulwark Goes to Hollywood. See you guys then.
Just Getting Started with Susie Schuster has stories of humble beginnings and humbling moments from inspiring people. Angela Kinsey.
Listen, I was on set one day on The Office, and I was like, we were talking about what's your good side, and I said, there's nothing really to that, right? That's like,
no, there is.
And our camera operator, Matt Soam, that I'd known for 8 years, and I go, Matt, what's my side? He was like, this side. I was like, seriously?
Oh.
He goes, yeah. He goes, I always try to frame you that way. I was like, why didn't you tell me 7 years ago?
The new Just Getting Started with Susie Schuster. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.